Good evening.
Evening.
This evening, we will be actually in several places, so I won't tell you where to open up to yet. But this evening, we are addressing a particular topic that came up quite recently, and it's something I thought about speaking on again anyway. And I wasn't sure how long ago it had been since I'd spoken on the issue of fasting. Turns out it was in 2019. Do you remember anything that happened before the year 2020? Because I don't. So, this lesson will be entirely new to you. Not really, but this lesson is the result of a study of this topic that I've done on a couple of occasions now. And the problem when it comes to fasting today is that when people bring it up, usually the response is a sort of reluctant and vague notion that, well, maybe that's something I should have been doing, and maybe I need to feel guilty about it. And maybe we do, but maybe we don't. And so we'll look at that tonight. We will try to give as thorough a survey as we can in the time that we have. And of course, to do that, we'll start out in the Old Testament, then we'll move to the New Testament, and we'll address this issue of fasting. So maybe first, before anything else, let's just give a definition for what we mean. Fasting can take on a lot of different forms, but generally speaking, we're talking about withholding food from oneself. And usually, sometimes that includes water. It depends. Today, most fasting that's done is done, as Max and I were talking about just a minute ago, it's done until sundown, and then you can kind of eat a little bit more or sometimes eat whatever you want, depending on what religious practice you're a part of. But one thing we want to say before we even enter into the Old Testament is that fasting seems to have been in existence about as long as religion has been. Maybe not all the way back to the beginning, but for a very long time, historically, a lot of different groups have fasted. So it's not peculiar to the Old Testament or to the New Testament, but it's something that people have done. And they do that for various reasons, sometimes religious, sometimes just cultural. Of course, today there's still many groups that do fast. There are Jews that will occasionally fast, but not all that often. But more often you think of Muslims fasting, and certainly they do most of the time again during the day. Taoists also will fast, as well as Baha'i faith will, and some other groups. But just to get that message across, it's not something we just see in the practices tied to the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. So, in the Old Testament, if we were to just think on our own for a minute about how often fasting comes up, probably we would tend to think that fasting is a pretty consistent issue that's brought up in the Old Testament, when it's really not. Instead, what we see are a few very prominent examples of fasting, and then enough scattered in there throughout the rest of it to make you think that, or to give that impression that it's very common. But the most famous examples are probably the ones of Moses, who fasts for 40 days in the wilderness when he's receiving the law, and then Elijah in a very similar pattern, and probably also at Mount Sinai, just like Moses, fast for 40 days. In both cases, they fasted not only from food, but also from water. Is that an example for us today? That cannot be an example for us today. We will die if we do that. So it was a miraculous intervention that was happening alongside the faith being displayed by those two individuals. With another example, it's not quite a true fast. The example of Daniel, you'll remember that he does fast in a way. That is, he refrains from the food that the king offers, but he does still eat food. And so it's not quite the same as a fast as we would think today. One thing that we sometimes skip over, we'll put fasting into one broad category and say, oh, well, there's an example of fasting, therefore it might be binding on the modern day believer. Well, fasting has multiple purposes. And that's true under the Old Testament, and that'll also be true as we go into the New Testament, which will be important for our study. Most of the time, when you see fasting in Scripture, not a huge majority, but a majority of the time, it's actually a show of either remorse or more often mourning that's being done on behalf of someone who has died, or perhaps the loss of a battle. For example, in 1 Samuel chapter 31, that's when Saul and his sons have been killed in battle. And so in verse 13, what do? They fast because they are in mourning for the king and for his sons. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 6, the people fast. This is after they have lost a battle, kind of in preparation for another battle that's going to take place. So sometimes we see that as a form of devotion maybe to God. We also see in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 3 that Jehoshaphat orders a fast of the people, and this is kind of another way of showing that they are dedicated to God and pleading for his help. Now, we see a number of those examples, but isn't that a strange example for us to try to bind today, where we would say a king has proclaimed a fast, therefore we should fast? Well, that's not how that works. Instead, that's someone else deciding for you that you should be doing this. It's not an internal spiritual decision. It may have some spiritual application, but ultimately it goes back to someone else's decision. Okay, so there's one example, though, that we get in the Old Testament that is a little bit more direct, and yet it's difficult to know exactly what was meant. The one time that fasting may be commanded under the old law, and this is it. There's no other example. There's not several commands to fast. There's this one time, and it deals with the Day of Atonement. So if you look in Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 29, I'll turn back there real quick. Exodus chapter 16 and in verse 29, again, this is the Day of Atonement. This is the holiest day of the year for the Jews. And it says in verse 29, "This shall be a statute forever for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls and do no work at all, whether a native of your own country or a stranger who dwells among you." Your translation may say something different than afflict your souls, but that phrase, at least according to some, is an intention for those people to fast. So the affliction or humbling is another way you can translate that word properly. And that's what it means. Either you're afflicting or you're humbling, but you're lowering yourself in the sight of God. But some take that to mean fasting. Well, that's not a very clear reference. And if it is a command to fast, that would be for one day of the year. And that would be it. And so it's not something that is as common as we would maybe think in looking at the Old Testament. Instead, all we see is a few examples, and most of them not really all that spiritual in nature. And the one time that it might be commanded, it's not totally clear what is meant when the command is given. Okay, so let's go into the New Testament. Again, I think in the New Testament, we kind of have the same feeling about the Old Testament, where we would go into it thinking that there is quite a bit of fasting that happens in the New Testament, and perhaps percentage-wise, there's a little bit more fasting in the New than there is in the Old. But even so, when we talk about the New Testament, there are really only 8 references to fasting when we get rid of a few that are quite specifically and clearly about mourning for the dead. And so we don't really want to include those. We will include a couple that touch on that, but they're not quite as cut and dry as some of those others. But what we want to say then is that there are about 8 legitimate references that may be teaching, exemplifying in some way this practice of fasting. So let's take a look at those, do a little survey of them. And we'll start with those in the Gospels. There are 5 references in the Gospels to fasting. And of course, some of these are going to be duplicates, so we're not going to address as they appear in multiple passages, but instead just one at a time. The first example you'll remember, you can find this in different places, but when Jesus is tempted, he fasts for 40 days, right? Well, who is that patterned after? Well, we saw the 2 examples prior to Christ. Not that Christ has to do this according to the pattern of Moses, and yet it's the same. He spends 40 days and nights fasting in the wilderness, just as Moses, just as Elijah has done. And as we said before, we cannot do that. We cannot fast from food and water for 40 days or we will die. And so that's not something that's going to be directly binding to us. It's also a very specific circumstance. You'd be hard-pressed to apply that to yourself that directly, to say that you're about to be tempted by Satan in person and you're preparing for that. But we'll leave that example aside for just a minute. And with all of this in the New Testament, it's not enough to go to the New Testament and be able to point to an example where someone fasts. What we would need to practice it today is to find an example where someone fasts really under the time period that the church is active, which is not the Gospels, but later on, Acts and the books after that. And then also we would need to find an example of someone who is a Christian who is fasting for a religious purpose. Anything short of that's not going to give us enough to go on to say that we should do it today. But that's just the first example. Jesus tempted in the wilderness. The second example is whenever we see sometimes we call this the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, or the tax collector. And so when we see this example, it's the Pharisee who is proud and saying that he fasts twice a week. Okay? Well, that was true at that time. Pharisees would fast twice a week, that is 2 days out of the week. And of course, he's doing this to put on a bit of a show and say, well, look how good I am because I fast. Well, is that the example that we want in order for Christians to fast today? No, that's not going to cut it. When we go a little bit farther, we also see Anna, the priestess, who is in the temple daily, fasting and worshiping God. That's in Luke 2. But when we give her example, we say yet again, is she under the new law? Well, she's not. And we would be kind of hard-pressed to say then that we are bound by her example, this one specific woman that happens to be written about in the New Testament. And I'm not trying to write any of these off, but you can spend longer in studying each passage and you'll come to the same conclusion. Inevitably, this example cannot be binding for me today. So what are the other examples that may go a little bit farther here? Well, one of them was read for us out of Matthew chapter 6 and in verse 16. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 16, Jesus says, "Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites, with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly I say to you, they have their reward. And when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you don't appear to be fasting, but your Father will reward you." Okay. So when we see Jesus say these words, is he commanding his followers to fast? And that may sound like almost a silly question, but there is a difference that has to be established here. The same thing could actually be said if you go back to verse 5, where he says, "And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites." What is the command? The command is a regulation that when you do this thing, you do it in this way. So what he's doing is regulating something that he assumes that his audience is going to be doing. Okay? Well, why would he assume that his audience is going to be doing this? They're Jewish, number one, and they're not under the new law, number two. So again, we're going to have a real struggle to say directly that we need to take this and apply it today. The best argument would be to say that Christ is the one who says it. That's fair, but does the New Testament not also regulate some other things that we would not necessarily want to take part in today? Does Jesus not say that the law regulates divorce? Does God want divorce to happen? No, but he says when you do get divorced, you do it only on this reason. The New Testament also, several times, regulates the way in which a master should treat their slaves. Is that condoning the practice, or is that regulating something that's an expected behavior of that time period? And so we would have to go a little bit farther, stretch this text a little bit to make sure that it applies to us today. That may not be the case. And so we'll say with this, that while he is regulating the whole practice of fasting, that doesn't necessarily mean he is binding it for Christians today. Next text comes from Matthew chapter 9 and in verse 15. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 15. We'll start with verse 14. "Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?'" Well, here we already have a little bit of a counter to what we were just talking about. Even though he's commanding how fasting should be done, He's accused not long after of his own disciples not fasting. Therefore, he cannot be teaching on a regular basis, you must fast 2 days a week or else you are sinful. Not the case. His own disciples are not fasting at this time. Okay? His response in verse 15, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and they will fast. Okay. This is kind of the same as before. There's an expectation that they will, in fact, fast. But there's a couple things that we could say about this text. Number one, what's the subject that Jesus is speaking about? He's speaking about himself, primarily, and he refers to himself as a bridegroom here, or that is the groom. And so he says, when the groom is here, they have no reason to fast. But when he leaves, there will be a reason to fast. Well, what's he referring to? But his own death. And he says, I'm here now. Why would my disciples fast? And he even says the phrase, mourn, along with this. So why would they mourn and fast? What's the implication? We're talking about that same cultural practice that we talked about from the Old Testament of fasting in association with mourning for the dead. Well, that by itself kind of throws this one out to say all he's really talking about is a non-religious fasting that's being done when someone has died. The other side of this, though, if you read the rest of the text, verse 16, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break, the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. What's the purpose of the text there? To say that you don't combine the old and the new, right? Well, you really want to try to use a passage like this to say that fasting is binding when Christ himself is saying that certain things are to be kept away from other things? Probably not the best example. Okay, so that's what we get in the Gospels. But let's go a little bit farther. There's a few examples that we have in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 13, 2 verses in a row will make reference to fasting. Again, Acts 13, and we'll look at verse 1 to start with. Acts 13, verse 1. Now in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, now separate to me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. Verse 3, then having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them away. Okay, so in this text, we have another example of fasting. This time it's being done in association with prayer. Now, most of the time when we see fasting, it's in association with prayer anyway, to the point that I would question if fasting by itself really has much value, or is it only when you do it in association with prayer? But that's kind of a side point there. But in this case, and in this text, what's happening is they are appointing somebody to an office. In this case, it's Saul and Barnabas being appointed to the office of missionary. And there is another example in chapter 14, verse 23, of the same kind of event happening. 14:23, it says, so when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord, in whom they had believed. So 2 examples. In both cases, we have leaders of the church who are already in that role, fasting in preparation for and in association with the appointment of new leaders or ministers in the church. I will say from the start, that's probably the best example that we have as far as how fasting might play a role in the church today. It may play a role in appointing those who are going to be in the service of the church, whether that be in the role of elders or of missionaries, maybe of other ministers as well. That being said, if you go to other places in Acts, for example, chapter 6 and verse 6, you remember the first deacons of a sort being appointed. That appointment happens without fasting. And there are other examples of that as well. And so, is it necessary? I don't know that you could say that. It is done on some occasions when there are appointments being made in the church. It's left out when other appointments are being made. And so it would be kind of difficult to say that it is required based on this. Alongside that, we would have the other issue of if fasting is appropriate for the appointment of those roles, then is the laying on of hands as well, because that's another peculiarity of these texts. And so if you're going to pick one, are you not going to pick the other to include in that as well? Okay, that's in the book of Acts. The one other place that we could turn to would be in 1 Corinthians and chapter 7. And in 1 Corinthians 7, the context is how people should live in marriage between a husband and wife. And when we get down to verse 5, so this is 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5, it says, "Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Very specific command and specific to husband and wife. So right off the bat, you might say, if you're single, would this fasting even apply to you? Not really. It wouldn't. And so that's kind of strange by itself. But in the context here, Paul is saying to, for a time, take a break from sexual union so that you can devote yourself to prayer and fasting, but only when the agreement has been made to do so. Okay, so is this a binding example of fasting for us today? There's two problems with that. The first one, if you're reading from a translation that's not King James or New King James, it doesn't say fasting. Because when you go back to the original manuscripts, that word fasting is maybe a later addition. And so we're not going to get into all of that, but that's why most modern translations leave out fasting, and it just says prayer. That by itself is enough reason to probably discount this as a way to bind fasting on someone today. The other issue, of course, is what we're talking about is abstaining in the context here. Can fasting not be applied to that? It very well could be. It could be more of a figurative fast rather than a fast from food. And so both of those things would make it very doubtful that this verse could apply either. That's the New Testament on fasting. That's not what we usually think when we start to approach the New Testament and think of this topic. And yet, if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to sit down and look at each example that we're given that might pertain to it, what do you find? You find that it's very much doubtful that fasting is a requirement for Christians today. Okay, what else can we say about this? We've looked at the Old Testament, we've looked at the New Testament. I guess we'll start by asking the question directly, is there enough evidence from the New Testament that Christians today should be fasting? And the answer is no, there's not. Now, Christ does say it, as we said, it's under the old law, and his own disciples don't fast. It's going to be hard to bind that. The book of Acts, a couple of examples, but they're only for the appointments in the church, and even still, it doesn't happen every time. So it's going to be very hard to make a positive case there that fasting is necessary. Besides that, we see even from the Old Testament, it really wasn't commanded. Instead, it was an example that was sometimes given by individuals, sometimes commanded by a king, but as far as its religious value, it doesn't quite seem to be there. Fasting, of course, has mostly faded away in church history, but early on, there was a fairly common practice among Christians of fasting. In fact, one of the books of the, not quite New Testament Apocrypha, but one of the later books that was written, the Didache, in chapter 8, it mentions that the Pharisees fast, I think it is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. And so it was understood by this somewhat early Christian author that they were in fact fasting, that a lot of Christians were fasting. But that too has faded away. Now that's not from the New Testament, that's from after the New Testament is completed. So that's going to be kind of difficult to make the case that we should still be fasting today, just because it's something they did early on in church history. The other question with this would be, can we fast? Not just is there an example of it, but would it be wrong for a Christian to fast? That one's a little more difficult, and I think there's probably some room there, somewhere in there, to say maybe under the right circumstances and with the right intention. But at the same time, it is not a way of showing dedication or piety to God that he has expressed a strong desire for today. And so why would I want to do something that God has not made perfectly clear to me that he wants me to do? It would be kind of like saying that maybe it's okay to offer animal sacrifice today because maybe at one point God desired that, although obviously the case for animal sacrifice is quite clear in the Old Testament where fasting is not. But it would be attempting to add something that is kind of questionable at best. The only legitimate use, as we said, may be in mourning, but if it is, then it is just for the cultural aspect of it. It's not really for the benefit of the spiritual side of things, or maybe in the appointing of elders and ministers, maybe. And then again, maybe not. It still may be customary there as well. Ironically today, fasting, especially if you scour the internet for fasting, it's become a little bit more trendy in recent years, especially I think because people like to look at it and say, oh, well, look at what I've rediscovered from the Bible that we aren't doing today. And they maybe get some kind of good feeling out of that. Maybe they're well-intentioned too. I'm not going to judge them for that, but that by itself is not a good enough reason just to say, well, it was something they did back then, maybe it's been forgotten about. Well, maybe it has, but maybe there's a reason for that. And maybe there's a reason that we don't fast today. I think the reason is because it's just not there enough. Another side of this, people make the argument that it is beneficial in other ways. Certainly, some people would point to weight loss that has no spiritual value there. Or maybe it's beneficial for other health reasons or for mental clarity. Those things may be true, and if you're fasting for those reasons, maybe that's okay. But at the same time, is that a spiritual reason to do that? It's not. And it's not something that is not something that makes anyone more righteous, not something that makes anyone more holy just because they get some kind of physical benefit out of this. So when it comes to fasting, I think we've made it pretty clear tonight, but what we can say as far as our own application goes, instead of seeking out something that's on the fringes of what God has spoken about in his word, focus on what God has made perfectly plain again and again that he desires for you to do. And tonight, that may mean that you need to become a Christian as the plan is outlined on numerous occasions in the New Testament. Maybe that you need to repent and return to God. Again, that's made obvious again and again in the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. But tonight, if you have any need to obey God tonight, then do so in the ways that he commands. And if you're willing to come forward now as we stand and sing, then do so.